Good evening and welcome to the Fourth Estate. My name is Raymond Mujuni. Here's a look at some of the stories that we're following up for the Fourth Estate this week. Tracking the coronavirus, the number of confirmed COVID-19 patients for Uganda has gone up mostly because of the truck drivers bringing in produce from the Mutukula, Busia and Malaba borders. How have journalists covered the story across the border? We talked to Kenyan journalist Kabale about how the Kenyan media and the Ugandan media are responding to those rising numbers.
The reporters we have in the border points are doing the best they can to try and relay whatever is going on to us.
The absence of an economic stimulus package has left many Ugandan businesses biting the dust. We also speak to Ugandan journalist Ismail Ladu, who is a business reporter with the Daily Monitor, on how the absence of an economic stimulus package is affecting the outcome of the pandemic for those in lockdown.
Seriousness that is being given to social and health measures should equally be given to the business and economic side.
And finally, we will speak to Nicholas Opio, who is a lawyer that has been representing at least 3 journalists that have been arrested during the pandemic period. Is it the time to discuss the state and media relations during a pandemic? Maybe that's it. Today, that's what we look at. At the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, the Ugandan government took sharp travel restrictions to be able to curb the number of infections that would come into the country. Those restrictions ground much of the air travel but left a lot of the inland and outland travel through the border points open. Uganda has at least 53 gazetted border entry points. 10 of those have checkpoints. Of the 10, we've now produced 18 trackers that have had COVID-19 confirmed cases. This has also brought into sharp contrast how journalism is reporting the COVID-19 outbreak across the countries of Uganda, Tanzania and Kenya mostly. This week, we speak to Nasibo Kabale about how this is happening at the East African and how journalism is reporting this cross-border story. So just briefly tell us, how has the Kenyan media been reporting the cross-border trucks movement and COVID-19?
So in the beginning, it was very easy. There was movement, so we could go to the border. We were able to report from border points and see what is actually going on. Now the movement is restricted, so it's very hard for us to go there and determine whether what the government is saying to be true or not. The reporters we have in the border points are doing the best they can to try and relay whatever is going on to us and the general public. So it's not been easy now with the restrictions, but we're trying best as we can to report from the field as much as we can.
There's been a lot of nationalism that has come up ever since at least for the Ugandan part. Many Ugandans are concerned. We've been in a 21-day lockdown, and the only way it can end is if cases stop rising. And the reason we have rising cases is that we have cross-border movement, and many of them are Kenyan truck drivers coming into Uganda. Have you felt the same nationalism in reporting in Kenya?
Yes, we have. I think right now we are looking at a story, just like you are looking at a story in what's going on in Kenya and how Kenya, whatever happens in Kenya affects what's happening in Uganda. We're looking at the same in terms of Tanzania. Tanzania has been slow in implementing some very serious protocols that would ensure that they have some level of, I don't know what to say, they would have some level of, they've done very little to ensure that they have control over the issue, that we have minimal transmission of the virus. So we are concerned at whatever is going on. So we are looking at how each person's responsibility affects the other. So if Tanzania does not do the best it can, then we're going to be affected. And if the same happens to us as Kenyans, if Kenya does not do whatever it can to, as much as it possibly can, to reduce the spread of the virus, then it's going to affect Uganda in turn. So it's like a ripple effect. Whatever happens in one country is really going to affect the next, especially here in East Africa. So we have that sense of nationalism at this point.
There's been demand for cross-border journalism. News houses across the borders being able to work together to put together a story that explains what's happening in East Africa Has that demand happened in Kenya, and in what form is it taking?
For many media houses, it would be hard to have a cross-border journalism at this point in time. But for us at Nation Media Group has various media houses across the East African continent. So it's easy to liaise with a reporter in Uganda, a reporter in Tanzania, a reporter in Rwanda, and know exactly what's going on in these countries. But I believe for a journalist who is not does not have this I don't know what to call it, but for a journalist who does not have this connection, a connection with Tanzania and a connection with Rwanda, it is very difficult for them. So I'm sure they feel that sense of not providing the full spectrum and going beyond what they could possibly do to report anything COVID related at this point.
Okay, now tell us about the Kenyan response. One of the things that Ugandan reporters have prominently put out is that the level of testing happening in Kenya might not just be enough because it's not catching the COVID-19 positive patients. And also the level of community spread in Kenya might just be too much depending on the number of tests that are being done. Have you felt that pressure to put the Kenyan government to account and say the number of tests that are being conducted might be flawed because we're seeing Kenyan truck drivers being tested positive at the Ugandan border?
Absolutely. I put this in my blog at Nation Prime this week. I was talking about testing, the importance of testing and tracing, and how it can flatten the curve. So Rwanda is leading per capita in terms of testing, followed by Uganda and Kenya. So, I mean, at this point, we should all be at par. Testing is what sets everybody apart, as we have seen in South Korea and other countries that have done well in flattening the curve. So for Kenya, I think we are doing very badly in terms of testing. They had done some estimates and said, some modeling, and said by end of this month we would have some 10,000 cases. But these modulations were done with certain parameters in mind, and one parameter is testing. They had anticipated that they would test around 250,000 people by the end of this month, and now we're looking at only 20,000 people. It's under 20,000 people who have been tested so far. So this is very concerning, because you cannot, it's like shooting in the dark at this point for the government. They're not doing everything they possibly could to ensure that we have control over this issue. So now we're here in Kenya, we're at the point where we have community transmissions. We have people who have never traveled, they've never interacted with people who traveled. They've caught the virus, and once it starts spreading, most of us here in the country, I don't know if it's the same for Uganda, but most of us here in the country are very asymptomatic. We don't show symptoms. So most of our patients are not showing symptoms, which is frightening. Someone who does not show symptom, did not interact with anybody, is not suspected to be COVID positive, is just moving around. So the virus is just hiding in plain sight, is what we can say at this point. As long as we don't do enough testing, we're just shooting in the dark, and we'll continue to do so for as long as we possibly could.
My final question is, so journalism for years has been known to cause behavior change in societies. And one of the things that COVID-19 has tasted is that societies need to have a behavior change. People need to accept lockdown. People need to accept to stay in their homes so that they don't transmit. People need to accept social distancing. How has journalism in Kenya, in this period, how have you worked towards having behavior change in the Kenyan society?
We have tried at first, before the WHO declared masks to be unessential. I think at Nation, we tried to do stories around masks and the importance of wearing masks. And then we tried to change, I don't know how in Uganda it is, but here in Kenya, when you say social distance, it means it's an oxymoron of sorts. So you have to say like physical distance, because it can be translated in various languages. So for someone in my village, when you tell them social distance, it means something so different. And we want to make the information as simple as possible for everybody. We've done various campaigns like the mask campaign that I've just talked about. We've done campaigns on importance of social distancing. It's really, really hard. Like when you go to interview someone and they decide, you know what, you can't hear me when I'm wearing a mask, and they remove the mask. I know I'm saying this but I'm in an office where I'm alone, so I can't have my mask up. But it's been hard to ensure that people, I mean, we are an African people. We have to shake hands. We have to do this and that. So for us, it's hard more than it is for other countries in Europe and all. But we're trying as best as we can to ensure that the message has gone home. We've done radio stations that have different vernacular radio stations have done shows trying to educate the masses. The president has gone to a vernacular station to try and normalize the message and talk to every single person in the country. And we've seen Swahili radio stations are also doing best as they can to try and make sure the message of social distancing, wash your hands and wear a mask is normalized in the country.
Following the announcement of total lockdown measures, a lot of inland trade suffered a dip. Now, many of Uganda's businesses are powered by the small and medium enterprises, which bring to the fold at least 65% of our GDP. The absence of an economic stimulus package meant that these businesses would suffer a great deal. Monitor journalists have been questioning government's economic stimulus package, considering that it wasn't arriving. But across the border in Kenya, the Kenyan government, even before announcing the lockdown, had announced a raft of measures that would stimulate the economy. We talked to Ismail Ladu, who is a senior business reporter at the Nation Media Group, about the lack of an economic stimulus package and how that's affecting small and medium enterprises in Uganda.
Imports have declined from US dollars 711.9 million, which was registered in January, to 701.34 in February. In March, it has gone down to 593.79 million.
The Ugandan economy is taking its punches in stride. Declining imports, declining tax revenue collections, and a general decline in intra-trade due to the COVID-19 lockdowns. Much of the decline is being felt mostly by companies that can now not meet their payroll and are adopting mass layoffs and closure altogether. Tony Ottawa sits at the helm of enterprise development of Uganda's biggest commercial bank. The bank is a pioneer lender to most of Uganda's small and medium enterprises that power over 67% of the economy. He says it is no longer business as usual.
Key thing has been things are not going to be the same. It's not business as usual. As we move ahead post-COVID, many businesses are going to have to transform. Many businesses are going to have to change the way they do things. So it's going to be a very massive learning curve.
There's been no formal government stimulus package for the economy, but in piecemeal addresses, the central bank has eased lending restrictions for banks and urged for loan rescheduling. Whether that affects most of the economy is still a matter of speculation. Activists like Arnold Kwesiga are now urging government to immediately release a functional stimulus package to protect both jobs and the economy.
The package maintains the businesses operating, and if the businesses are operating, it means they can actually maintain their staff on their payroll. That is the simplest form of way of looking at it. Because if you're providing any form of incentive to a business, then they don't have reasons to shut down and lay off people, because then there is a way of government intervening in this pressure they're undergoing.
NTV understands that two economic papers that will be the bedrock of the economic stimulus package are still a matter of debate between the Ministry of Finance, the central bank and the president.
Start with what's it been like reporting about the government stimulus package or an economic stimulus package?
Well, to be honest with you, I think the government hasn't taken the economic side as serious as the social and the health aspect of the pandemic. I think two things. One is either they think they will have enough time to deal with the economic side of things, or two, there is no proper plan yet on how to deal with the economic side of things. So these are my two quick gut feelings.
If like looking at the article that you authored this week, asking the government's economic stimulus package, where is it? What was the reasoning behind the writing of this article?
Yeah, first of all, I think the seriousness that is being given to social and health measures should equally be given to the business and economic side, because at the end of the day, these two things cannot work in isolation. It reminds me, many years ago when I used to be in school, and we used to debate things like mother and father, water and fire, which one is better. At the end of the day, we realized that both are important. So while dealing with the social and health measures, which I must commend government for the effort in that regard, the same attention and seriousness should be given to economics and the business aspect of the thing, or the entire package of the whole thing, if you like.
As a business reporter, can you tell us what COVID-19 has done to the economy? We've seen some very grim figures. The Ministry of Trade says about 4,200 businesses closed. The number of trucks coming to the country has reduced. Trade has completely died out in the central business district. What does the economy look like from your reporting?
Well, look, even before the COVID-19, the economy was already struggling. Of course, there were some kind of signs that it's picking up, but it wasn't really in good shape. Okay, and the other thing, even before we were hit by this pandemic, we could have done something, because once it became obvious that China was grappling with the pandemic, given the fact that they are our biggest trading partner, it's no brainer that our economy will be affected. Remember, we are a net importer, and our reliance on Chinese goods, as far as I'm concerned, is quite sickening. So the moment this virus reared its ugly head in China, that was the beginning of the problem of the economy. Now, by the time even the economy was shut down and all that, the picture was grim. Things were not looking as good. So to answer your question, the shape of the economy before COVID and during COVID and after COVID is going to be bad news.
There's been some arguments fronted that, when you look at what the central bank has done, reducing the CBR to 8%, granting relief for commercial banks to restructure loans, some people argue that that in itself is a form of a stimulus package that has been issued out to small and medium enterprise businesses. And as a business reporter, do you think that this is a stimulus that's working for the small and medium enterprises?
Raymond, look, this is how can I put it? It is not enough. Okay, it's not enough. What is enough is, one, the amount of money that the SME, small and medium enterprises, or government is massive. Okay, first of all, that money must be paid. These are the kind of stimulus packages we are talking about. Some kind of tax breaks and waivers. These are kind of the stimulus packages that the business community are waiting for, and it's not coming. So what the central bank is doing in terms of reducing CBR and all that, it's good. Remember, it's been happening even way before the outbreak of this pandemic, but the complaints still remain that the commercial banks, for instance, were not responding to some of these gestures by the central bank. So that's not enough. The business community, the manufacturers, traders are hoping for much more than that. I can tell you that government the people who supplied garments alone in the last financial year need at least more than 2 to 3 trillion, which is unpaid in debt as we speak right now. Okay, so these are some of the amount of arrears that should be cleared by government, and there is no better stimulus package than just paying off all the domestic arrears by government. And these are the conversations that we are not seeing happening right now.
In your reporting during the week, you tried to ask the Ugandan government about their economic stimulus package, but also in the reporting you pointed out the Kenyan stimulus package. Kenya has a big economy. They've been able to afford lakhs for pay as you earn, for example. They've been able to reduce corporation tax. Do you think that the Ugandan government can afford a stimulus package in the same manner that the Kenyan government has afforded the economy of Kenya?
Raymond, it doesn't have to be in the same manner as the Kenyan government or the way other governments are doing elsewhere. Okay, we can do it in our own way, but you see, the Kenyan government has already told us how it can be done. Now, the gist of the matter is that there is no enough attention being given on this issue of stimulus package. I think because the head of the state, the president himself, hasn't committed himself so much about that. I think once he begins to give it some kind of attention, anything is possible. It can even be much more than what the Kenyans have done. I've been speaking to a few government officials, and they've told me that there is something in the pipeline, but because it appears that the cabinet hasn't agreed on it yet, and it also appears that the president hasn't pronounced himself on it yet. So everybody is is cagey about that. But there is some kind of package that has been worked on by the Ministry of Finance, and possibly by the end of next week, it could be made public. But it appears that one man is not in favor of it yet, and that's the head of state. Once he approves it, the cabinet could could buy into it, and we may see something. But as we speak right now, the word stimulus package seems not to be the most popular kind of idea within the government.
My final question to you is the truck drivers question. It's very much a business story. Uganda gets most of its essential goods through Malaba border and also through the Mutukula border. And those two border points have produced the last 12 cases of COVID-19. There's been a general argument that there should be a blockade of all truck drivers coming to the country. How is this likely to affect business? And if government should adopt any measures, how should they adopt them?
Well, of course, we are reliant on sea, which is in Kenya, Mombasa, and it's look again. That can be solved. What my view is that we can have Kenyan drivers bring it up to the border point, then our own drivers can take it up from there. I mean, it's as simple as that, and that can still maintain. I mean, that will not disrupt the flow of goods and cargo in any way. It's just a matter, and that's actually, it's more of a political decision than a business decision. So for me, it's really a no-brainer. Let the Kenyan truck drivers bring it up to the border point. We have the trucks disinfected, and our drivers take it up from there to inland. And for me, it's more of a political decision that the political leaders in the region either afraid to take or are not taking for whatever reason, and of course it will have
of history, the execution of the duties of the fourth estate can sometimes run counter to the execution of the duties of the state. With the presence of a global health pandemic and restrictions on movement, this has come into sharp contrast in Uganda. At least 4 journalists in the last 2 weeks have been arrested and detained for doing their job or for simply being journalists. This week we also talked to Nicholas Opio, who was firstly a panelist of the very premiere episode of the Fourth Estate, but is now a lawyer representing some of the journalists that have been detained, to tell us how the state and the media relations are happening during this global health pandemic.
We just wanted to start with, what's it been like for the media and relating with the state during the lockdown? We've seen at least 3 arrests in Arua, in Jinja, and that of Samson Kasumba. What's that relationship been like?
I think that the public health concern has overridden media freedom to the extent that media practitioners are so keen to parrot the official position as opposed to ask tough questions of government officials. In so many instances, government officials have gotten away with outright lie, manipulations, and the media has been unable to ask the tough questions. I think that is partly because of the overriding concern about public health and the need to address this pandemic, but also because of the continuing intolerance to critical media voices, especially for journalists that work up country, for local FM stations, for local media houses. Resident district commissioners and district security organizations officers have really clamped down so hard on the media and only permitted the media to say that which they think should be said. So officialdom has allowed the media to behave as though they're embedded reporters with a troop at a war zone, so that they can only tell us what the officials tell them. Asking anything else would attract arrests, intimidation, or harassment of a media house or a journalist.
Was this something that was anticipated, that with a public health concern and much of the state functioning in what many would call a state of emergency, was it something that was anticipated that media freedoms would come into sharp contrast?
The thing about the media is that in times of crisis such as that we're in, the state relies on them to be able to inform the public, especially in a country where the public broadcaster is really, for lack of a better word, in a sorry state and unable to capture the audience. So the weakness of the public media or the public broadcaster gives a higher responsibility on the private broadcasters to be able to communicate with the public and be able to relay accurate, timely information to address a pandemic such as this. The flip side is that the media also has to ask tough questions of the government in cases where we suspect misinformation, in cases where we expect concealment of information, or in cases where we expect corruption, or really in cases where there's gross human rights violations. The media must be able to highlight that. Now, the private media finds itself in a difficult position because of the weakness of the public broadcaster. And so focus is now on stations such as NTV, that is the #1 country station in Uganda, that is watched by thousands of people across the country, which exerts much pressure on them. And I think that unless we address the concerns around the weakness of the public broadcaster, repression, harassment is going to continue to focus on private broadcasters, and especially the pressure being put on their owners, because the owners have a business interest above, unless do a public disservice as opposed to a public service.
All right, Nicholas, my final question to you would be, the arrest that we saw earlier this week of Samson Kasumba, where police literally told the media that the reason we've arrested Samson Kasumba is not because of his journalistic work. How should the media report such instances?
Well, first of all, this matter is under investigation. And as a person who is representing Samson Kasumba in that case, I'm very hesitant to discuss the details of the case. But I think that the media must go over and above the individual case of Samson Kasumba to highlight the question of abuse of power, the use of the power of the state to settle personal scores, to abuse fundamental rights and freedoms. In the case of Samson, he's a high-profile individual. He was able to be released after just a night in custody and released in the middle of the night. Very few people have the privilege to do so. I think we must focus on the use of public office to settle personal scores, the use of public office to entrench what I see as a partisan political agenda of the NRM, because they've locked out everybody else from speaking. If you're an opposition member of parliament distributing food, like the Honorable Zake, you would be arrested very promptly and subjected to torture. But if you're an Ifaka warrior distributing food in Zimbabwe, you probably will get away with it. So the use of the pandemic to settle all political scores, but also to entrench the NRM and the person of President Museveni as the alpha and omega of every problem. I think the media needs to focus on the subtle use of this pandemic to denigrate human rights, but also to entrench a partisan perspective. If you hear the Minister of Health and every public official speaking, they will glorify President Museveni as the key leader in this fight against COVID-19. What is a certain message there is the political dividend that accrues to the NRM and to President Museveni, especially in a period in which we're running up to elections in February of 2021.
And Nicholas, just a final note, which is rather on a light note. The first episode of the Fourth Estate had you on it, and now things have changed pretty much drastically. How are you able to do work during this lockdown? How have you had to change your life?
I mean, I've taken the personal sacrifice of having to walk every day. So I've been walking 18 kilometers to be able to get to a police station to rescue somebody in need, to be able to get to my office, to be able to send that email, to communicate with people who have to use our services. So I'm having to walk. My car is parked, the battery is dead. I'm unable to walk. To drive to work. So I think that many years after the beginning of the Fourth Estate, in which I was privileged and honored, thanks to NTV, to be a pioneering panelist, we have seen, back then we could ask government of anything, could say all the kind of things we wanted to say. People now have very careful. They have to tread very carefully lest you be arrested for doing acts that would spread the disease. So I think that this is what I think is September 11th all over again. We used to use terrorism and security as an excuse for clamping down on rights, for giving away our freedom of expression, our freedom of privacy. Now we are using the pandemic as an excuse. I hope, and I really hope, that after this pandemic, we can be able to go back to normalcy, in which we can speak freely, in which the media can ask tough questions, in which everybody can ask tough questions, and commentators like myself can come back on the Fourth Estate and stick it in the face of a government minister and say, what you're doing is wrong, without fear of being arrested or fear of not being able to get back to my house in the middle of the night.
Thank you so much for remaining tuned to the Fourth Estate. We continue to uphold our role as a critique of how the media covers stories across the week. Now this week, we'll leave you with something very interesting. You might have been wondering why very many people on social media were asking why Ramaphosa cannot wear a face mask. Even us are left asking at the Fourth Estate. But today we leave you with a video of Cyril Ramaphosa saying he will start a TV media channel to teach South Africans how to wear a mask. Now, even here, we're excited to watch that TV channel when it finally starts. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Raymond Ojeni. See you again next week